LYF Bible Study. This is Lesson 23, Halakha. Halakha is Hebrew for the way you should walk. It is often translated as the Jewish law, or the law, or traditions, Jewish traditions regarding the law, what have you. But it literally means the way you should walk. And it's going to be the theme of our lesson today as we examine Jesus being asked a number of halakhic questions and responding in kind, where we see Jesus being asked questions about the law and how that should be applied, and we see him give answers to the same. Now, before we get started, we're going to do a little bit of review, as always. So last week we saw Jesus had passed through Jericho. He had healed Bartimaeus, the blind beggar. He has visited Zacchaeus, and he's illustrated through his miracles and his examples what he has preached before, both in parable form and in what we could call precept form, in saying you should do this. Well, now he's living it out. He's even on the way to his death. We also examined the triumphal entry, where Palm Sunday, where he enters into Jerusalem, with everything about that event pointing to his messianic status, pointing to the time of the year that it is in Jerusalem with the Passover, and how this has been received by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And we left last week where Jesus was lamenting over Jerusalem, showing his foreknowledge of what was about to happen and what the consequences of it would be and how God would respond to it. So with that in mind, we're going to start with Luke chapter 19, verses 45 through 48. Then he went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in it, saying to them, "It is written, 'My house is a house of prayer,' but you have made it a den of thieves." And he was teaching daily in the temple. But the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people sought to destroy him, and were unable to do anything, for all the people were very attentive to hear him. This is a pretty famous passage. It's a pretty famous story. It appears in all of the Gospels to varying degrees of detail. And it's worth going over a few of this behind-the-scenes details that give some context to what Jesus is doing here. So, money changers. Around feast times, especially Passover and Yom Kippur, you had to bring sacrifices. But there was still a large Jewish diaspora. They were spread around the Roman Empire into other empires at that time. In fact, the Persian Empire was also a center of Jewish thought and belief in Babylon. And so when you have to go to Jerusalem and travel this great distance, you might not be able to bring animals with you, especially if you were poor. I mean, this is a long walk. It may involve a sea voyage. You can't necessarily bring the requisite sacrifice. So initially, it was thought, well, why don't we sell sacrifices in Jerusalem? Which, at its surface, is fair. It's a good system at the beginning. But the priests, the Sadducees, remember these are people who do not believe there are going to be eternal consequences for their actions, decide that this is an opportunity for profit. And because the priests don't have to pay any taxes for money changing, they set up this system where you can only buy sacrifices with special coins. You have to get your foreign coins changed to this special coin, changed to this special currency. And this system was set up in a really nasty way so that it would often victimize foreigners. It would victimize non-Judean or Israelite Jews. In fact, it would even victimize some Israelite Jews. If you're a poor person from Galilee, you may not be able to bring a lamb all the way to Jerusalem. It's a dangerous trip. So sometimes you're going to be ending up with someone paying double or even quadruple the tax because there's this so-called burden in exchanging their money. Now, it's estimated that these money changers, who are very often Levites or allied with the Sadducee sect, they were making at least 10%, if not more, profit off of this little arrangement. It's worth noting, by the way, that in the Old Testament, there was a strict charge against profiting off of your fellow Israelites. It was called usury. You were not allowed to charge interest. Now, that's its own discussion. We won't get into it too much, but the goal of that wasn't really to establish a banking system. The goal of that commandment was to say, you are all Israelites, and you are not to profit off of each other. You are to respect and honor each other as fellow inheritors of the covenant. But beyond this, there was also, again, there was an animal market at the temple. But again, you paid a lot more for the animals. You paid an astronomical amount for the animals if you bought them at the temple. It was a convenience tax, it's essentially, because if you were going to get an animal sacrificed, even if you brought it with you, you had to bring it in front of a priest who could examine it and say, is it clean or not? If it wasn't clean, you had to go get another one. So there were other markets in Jerusalem. We've actually found some of these, the archaeological sites of them. And some of these markets weren't that expensive, but remember last week the number of people that are going to be in Jerusalem at this time. It's going to be astronomical. So you're going to have to go get a sheep or a goat, wait in line again, and risk it still not being clean. So you're paying this high tax essentially for convenience. And again, this was a major burden on the poor. It was rigged in the priest's favor, and it was a subject of a great deal of contention. In fact, there had been a long history by the time Jesus does this of rabbis and sages, both Pharisee and just what we might call your more typical Orthodox figures, denouncing this practice. There was a lot of strife between the Sadducees and other Jews because of it. In fact, one rabbi named Baba ben Buta, who was the one who came up with telling Herod to expand the temple, he actually was so outraged once at how greedy the priests were being that he ended up paying for thousands of sheep out of his own pocket so that the poor could provide sacrifices. And in fact, by the 60s AD, so after the time of Jesus, the Pharisees actually cleansed these markets themselves. They specifically set up a courtyard where they set up camp in the courtyard, and they turned it literally into a court, into the Sanhedrin, because they didn't want the Sadducees to continue fleecing, no pun intended, other Jews, including, by the way, other priests even. This, the part of the Talmud that talks about this mentions that part of their charges were, you're not even just messing with non-Levites, you're messing with your fellow Levites and your fellow priests. There's even a story, and it's likely not true, but in fact I would almost definitely say it's not true, but it shows the zeitgeist that Jesus is operating in here, that the temple itself was so sick of this practice that it screamed, "Get ye forth, ye sons of Eli, for you defile the temple of God." And this was a really controversial practice, and it was not something that was really liked, but it was also beyond a lot of people's power to do anything. No one wanted to challenge the priests. The priests, remember, are in bed with the local magistrates, especially the Romans, who are also, they have a vested interest in this as well. You tended to keep your power as priest by bribing the magistrates. So the magistrates want the priests to keep money. So people are getting sick of this, and they're already sick of this, but no one's done anything until Jesus comes in, and we know from the other Gospels, he actually forms a whip and just starts beating these people and driving them out. And he has the right to do this because this is his house. He is God. And what he's doing is also it's so intimately connected to the triumphal entry. Remember that the Messiah is supposed to come and make things right. Well, one of the things that Jesus is doing here is cleansing the temple. It's why it's called the cleansing of the temple, this passage is, because he's driving out this abuse and this taking advantage, I can't think of another term, this taking advantage of the Israelites by the priestly class. And so he goes nuts because this is the opposite of everything they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be ministering to Israel. Remember, the priests are the leaders of Israel. But instead of ministering to them, they are taking advantage of the flock. And Jesus, in righteous anger, has his way with them. He has his revenge on them. It's a tiny picture of what he's going to do at the end of time, but it would have also really gone along with what people were expecting in a lot of ways, because he's purifying the temple around Passover, the start of the Jewish New Year, in ecumenical terms, ecclesiastical terms. The same way that we start the church New Year at Advent, Jews start their calendar year at Passover. Indeed, Passover was the start of the New Year in the Old Testament. So obviously, Jesus is he's not playing to the crowd. That's not why he's doing this. But the crowds are probably still following him. He's probably gone right to the temple. There's been a lot of fervor, and the Sadducees can't do anything about it, because if they try to seize Jesus, there will be a lot of consequences. And it's likely that this event is going to be, and a lot of the events we're going to also talk about today, are what's going to bring Jesus into contact during this week with men like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. If you read John 3, which is Jesus' discourse with Nicodemus, where Nicodemus comes to him secretly at night, a lot of scholars date that discourse to this time, because John starts his gospel, remembering that John isn't a linear gospel, it's more of a rabbinic collection. John places Nicodemus' meeting with Jesus right after the cleansing of the temple. And so this is going to endear Jesus to a lot of people. They've already been waiting for him to come, because they're like, okay, well, the priests want to kill him. Is he going to come to the feast this year? And not only does he come to the feast, but he brings with him this messianic fervor, this messianic imagery, and now this messianic wrath and promise of cleaning up the temple. This is also a bit of another spotlight change. We've seen that the Pharisees and the Sadducees met together, and it's the Sadducees who took the lead. It was Caiaphas specifically who says, you know what, we just need to murder Jesus. It's expedient. It's expedient that one person should die for the nation. And Jesus has been challenging the Sadducees. By raising Lazarus, he challenged them already because they believed in no resurrection from the dead, and he publicly demonstrated that wasn't true. And now he's kind of come for them again because he's hit them where it hurts, and that's their wallets. This was going to be one of the prime times of the year for them to pad their pockets with the coins of pilgrims, and Jesus has completely taken away their ability to do that, and they don't have anything they can do about it because it is corrupt. And it's not like they can just go to the Romans, because the Romans aren't going to want to get involved in a religious matter. This is entirely internal. The Romans are going to tell them, you deal with this, you're the religious leaders. This is not our department. He's not broken Roman law by doing this. But it's going to intensify the anger. Again, just to go over the Sadducees, and specifically the Sadducees and their idea of Halakha. The Sadducees are also known as the Zadokim. They're named after Zadok, the first priest who served in the temple, the one who anointed King Solomon. But they are theologically liberal. They are theologically liberal. They do not take a lot of the Bible literally. In fact, they don't even trust the prophets. They don't believe in the prophets at all. They say they may be useful, but they typically say that these are kind of images. They're nice stories, but they're not real in any sense, which may sound familiar. Now, they also have their own legal scholars. Now, in Hebrew, it's hard to trace always where these are being referred to, because they're called the Sopharim, the scribes, but that also sometimes is tied with the Pharisees. So you have to look at the context, remembering that Hebrew is a very contextual language. But if we look at the Talmud, we look at other literature that comes from this time, there were scribes that worked for the Sadducees. They were often Levites or temple officials, and they themselves also focused on an interpretation of Halakha. And it was very much tied up in the idea of the Torah itself. The Pharisees are building fences around Torah, and the Pharisees will eventually create the Talmud. The Sadducees focus entirely on the Torah, but they are not any better. In fact, they're a lot worse at expositing it in terms of what it actually meant. They are very good at fulfilling the letter of the law without paying any regard to the spirit of it. And so there was a long history at this time, and it would continue beyond Jesus until the temple's destruction, of Pharisees and Sadducees just going at it regarding Halakha. How are we to live? How does the law apply to us? And we're going to see now that the Pharisees and Sadducees, in the light of Jesus entering as the Messiah, the Pharisees told him, hey, why don't you shut up those people who were basically calling you the Messiah? And Jesus says, if they didn't say these things, the stones would cry out, basically saying, if they would, it is sinful not to praise me. The stones themselves would bear witness of who I am. Now he's gone in and he's cleansed the temple. This demands an answer. And so all of these parties are going to come and they're going to talk to Jesus, and they're going to ask him to give his views on Halakha. They're going to challenge him, test him, and do so with, shall we say, less than above board intentions. So moving into Luke chapter 20, verses 1 through 8. Now it happened on one of those days, as he taught the people in the temple and preached the gospel, that the chief priests and the scribes, or Sopharim, together with the elders, confronted and spoke to him, saying, "Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who is he who gave you this authority?" But he answered and said to them, "I will also ask you one thing, and answer me. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men?" And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But if we say from men, all the people will stone us, for they are persuaded that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where it was from. And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." So again, a couple of things in the background here to cover. The idea of smika, which we have talked about before, it's ordination. It literally means laying on of hands. Excuse me. It's traced back in Jewish thought all the way to Joshua being ordained by Moses. It's traced through Ezra the scribe in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. They believed they had, kind of like we view apostolic succession. We can trace back through traditions and through lineages all the way back to the apostles, not in the sense of a cosmic game of tag, but in the sense of whose traditions we bear and in whose footsteps we walk. They had that all the way back to Moses. And Smika was your source of authority. Anyone could go around and talk about Scripture. That was what Jews did for fun, basically. The Torah was such a part of their lives. Anyone could talk about the plain meaning of Scripture. Jesus has gone beyond that. He's not just going and saying, "Remember the law, return to the law." He is giving new interpretations. And now he's come in and used the law and the Old Testament, or the Tanakh, as a justification for beating up the Sadduceic partisans who have been taking advantage of the people in the temple. And they want to know, okay, well, who ordained you, basically? Samika was granted generally by a tribunal of 3, and at least one of these people had to be ordained. So there had to be at least 3 people, and one of them had to be ordained. There is an actual formula to this. It goes Yoreh, Yoreh, Yadin, Yadin. May he teach, he may teach. May he judge, he may judge. There was also the idea that a rabbi could ordain his disciples. That was very extant, though not uncontroversial at this time. And some people even believed that the students of a rabbi could recognize his ordination as well. It was almost this populist idea that if enough Jews recognize a man to have this authority, he has this authority because the nation of Israel is righteous and versed in the law, and no one could truly garner up a following if he was not saying something of worth. So there were a lot of paths to Smika. But there were some general ideas, and one of them was it has to be conferred on you by someone with power. And smika was required because if you're going to teach with authority, and this is something that Jesus has already been done, because they even said this in an earlier chapter, this man speaks as if he had authority. He speaks with authority. He's giving laws. When Jesus even uses an expression that we see in the Talmud, we see from other rabbis. You have heard it said, ... But I say unto you, ... So you have heard the law. I say to you this new idea of what it means. Jesus has done this with Sabbath law. He has done this with the oral traditions. In fact, he has taken great pains to violate them. And because he doesn't think they're worthwhile and he thinks they're sinful, they are a burden on men, such as the Sabbath restrictions. And he's even gone around declaring who is and is not pure and what makes and does not make individuals pure. Now, even though there were various paths to smika, it had to be recognized by the Sanhedrin generally. And some people even said that if it wasn't recognized or even given to you by the Sanhedrin, it wasn't valid. Now, it's not that asking him about his authority was inherently wrong. Because of what he's done, they have a right to say, okay, where does this power come from? But that's not what they're doing. They're not asking a genuine question here. And Jesus is very aware of this, and we can see it from his response. Because they say to him, well, we don't want to say it came from John. Because when Jesus asks them, well, who did John's power come from? He's doing something very rabbinic. He's responding to a question with a question. And he'll do this again multiple times in what we read today. But he says, the baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men? So he's basically saying, the ministry of John, was it divine or human? Did John have authority? And the answer is, of course, John had authority. And John publicly declared Jesus to be the Messiah at his baptism and numerous times afterwards. This was publicly done. There were way more than 3 people there. And if John was truly ordained, then he had this power. John was ordained. He was of priestly lineage. He was recognized. And note that there's questions about this because they don't even bother saying, well, he wasn't officially recognized, even though they don't particularly seem to like him. They just don't like the idea that Jesus has authority, so they decide to try to avoid the question. And if you've ever witnessed rabbinic teaching, or you can even find videos of how this goes, you can find rabbinical lectures on YouTube if you're genuinely interested, this is the worst response you can give to a rabbi. Because if you're genuinely asking a question, and the rabbi asks you a question, you're going to try to answer it. And you're going to potentially even try to answer it with another question. It's almost Socratic. You build on each other, and that's how you learn. That's how you're taught. They're trying to avoid the issue. And if you say things like that to a rabbi, or you give just the plain, simple answer, and you don't play the game, as it were, you don't understand what the question stands for and why it's being asked of you, the rabbi isn't going to engage you. And that's exactly what Jesus does. He refuses to engage with them. He's like, okay, if you're not going to answer me honestly, you're not playing along, you're clearly not asking me a genuine question, you're just trying to trap me, you are not worth my time, and I'm not going to answer your question. But he actually kind of does, but he does it in what is technically a parable, but it is so barely a parable that, we'll see. It is quite clear what he's saying. So let's go to verses 9 through 19 of Luke chapter 20. Then he began to tell the people this parable. A certain man planted a vineyard, leased it to vine dressers, and went into a far country for a long time. Now at vintage time he sent a servant to the vine dressers, that they might give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the vine dressers beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again he sent another servant, and they beat him also, treated him shamefully, and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent a third, and they wounded him also and cast him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Probably they will respect him when they see him." But when the vine dressers saw him, they reasoned among themselves, saying, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, that the inheritance may be ours." So they cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, what will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those vine dressers and give the vineyard to others. And when they heard it, they said, "Certainly not." Then he looked at them and said, "What then is that is written? The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Whoever falls on that stone will be broken, but on whomever it falls, it will grind him to powder." And the chief priests and the scribes that very hour sought to lay hands on him, but they feared the people, for they knew he had spoken this parable against them. Again, this is technically a parable, but it's so barely a parable because it is quite evident, and this is probably surprising to them. He wasn't at Jerusalem when they plotted to kill him, but he's almost like perfectly describing the meeting that Caiaphas presides over, where he says, well, we got to kill him. It's expedient that one man should die for the nation. It's quite clear he knows what they're talking about and what they've been doing, and they're terrified and they're angry because he's called them out quite publicly and barely even bothered to disguise it. This is so blatantly obvious a parable that it interprets itself, and they quite clearly understand what he's saying, especially that bit where he says, he shall give the vineyard to others. So in this context, obviously, God is the vineyard owner. The rulers of Israel, from Exodus onwards, quite literally from Exodus all the way to the current time Jesus is talking, are the evil vine dressers, and the servants who the vineyard owner sends are the prophets, from Moses to John the Baptist. Jesus is obviously the son and the heir who they plot to kill. And Jesus has already kind of addressed this idea. He's even called out the Pharisees for it, saying, you honor the prophets, but you killed them and you built their tombs. And now he's just taking it one step further. And the Sadducees understand what Jesus is talking about, and what he's basically saying is God's done with you. And the consequences this time are God's going to be done with you permanently. He's taking your inheritance away. Now, that doesn't mean he's done with the nation of Israel. Remember what we talked about last week with Romans 11. He is talking specifically to the leadership of Israel. And remember, history is cyclical. Redemptive history up to this point has been very cyclical. Literally from pretty much the Red Sea, in fact, not even before the Red Sea. During the plagues, Israel routinely turns on Moses. Moses goes to God routinely and says, I am done with these people. I cannot take it anymore. And God says, okay, I'm going to send some judgment on them, and then you're going to take over for me again. I got you. Let's do this. He did this throughout the book of Judges. He does this with the kings of Israel. He does this with the exile into Babylon. It is a consistent cycle that keeps getting more and more extreme, and this is the culmination of it. This is the culmination of redemptive history from Abraham to this point, because God's going to officially take away the sign of the covenant with Israel. The priestly class will lose its power. As a matter of interest, by the way, we still know who priestly families in Jewish culture are. They tend to have certain names. Like, if you've ever heard the last name Cohen, it literally means priest. We know who these people are. That has been preserved all this time. But Levites have very little power. The closest thing to power they have is they're generally supposed to be the ones who pronounce the blessing at the end. Ironically, the same blessing we often receive at the end of the liturgy. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you peace. That is something that can only be done by a Cohen. But a Cohen originally existed to offer sacrifices. And God's taking that away. They exist to serve in the tabernacle and the temple. And God's about to take that away. Because they've decided to kill the heir, God is shifting focus. He's taking the blessings away, and he's going to give them to another. But Jesus isn't just done there, because they say, certainly not. God wouldn't do that to us. And Jesus responds by quoting Psalm 118, the very same psalm that they quoted while he entered Jerusalem. With the passage, the stone the builders have rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it is wondrous in our eyes. And he's calling this out now as a judgment. He's saying, I'm the Messiah, and if you don't accept me, to not accept me is one thing, that's the tripping on it and falling and being broken. But you're going to trigger full judgment. I'm going to fall on you, and I'm going to grind you to powder. So Jesus is making, in context, a messianic claim. He's told the Sadducees point blank, I know what you're planning, and this is what's going to happen. They understand him, and yet the only thing that stops them from doing it right then and there is the fear of the people, who are most likely going to be on Jesus' side, considering Jesus has just stopped something they've been outraged with for a very long time in the temple. So, the rulers of the people are ticked, and this isn't necessarily just Sadducees at this point. There are, in fact, we know for a fact, definitely Pharisees that are a part of this as well. So moving to the next 6 verses. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous, that they might seize on his words in order to deliver him to the power and the authority of the governor. Then they asked him, saying, Teacher, we know that you say and teach rightly, and you do not show personal favoritism, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, Why do you test me? Show me a denarius. Whose image and inscription does it have? They answered and said, Caesar's. And he said to them, Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. But they could not catch him in his words in the presence of the people, and they marveled at his answer and kept silent. Now, again, this is not just the Sadducees. These are Pharisees allied with the Sadducees. I've been defending the Pharisees a lot. Actually, in St. Matthew's Gospel, it says it's the Pharisees and the Herodians who do this. So you have here like the Orthodox, the conservatives, the ones who care about the law and who believe mostly in right things, that they've perverted a little bit, but they're still mostly on track in the grand scheme of things, compared to the Herodians, who are these Hellenized, liberal, small l, not in a political sense, deniers of the resurrection, deniers of life eternal, etc. They are uniting around how much they despise Jesus Christ. So they're trying to trap him in an impossible situation, and they rely on the Pharisees to do this first, because Jesus is, up to this point, speaking mostly in a Pharisaic context. He's mostly come to terms with and come to blows with the Pharisees. He hasn't really engaged the Sadducees yet. And this is an impossible situation. He has three choices, and neither of them, from the people asking this question's perspective, goes well for him. If he says it's unlawful to pay taxes to Caesar, he can be charged and brought before Pilate. If he says yes, he's siding with an unlawful government that is widely despised, and the people will turn on him. But note how they start with their questions, and they say, "We know that you say and teach rightly, and do not show personal favoritism, but teach the way of God in truth." So they're questioning his abilities and rights as a rabbi. They're saying, "We know you have the authority to give halakha. We know you do it so well, so won't you just answer this question for us?" And if he doesn't engage them, he also weakens his position. Now, before we get into this, I want to say something, and that is that Jesus is not making a political statement here. A lot of people have historically taken this passage to varying degrees of being widely out of context. For instance, the Christianized Roman emperors, such as Constantine and those forward, tried to use this as some sort of argument for the divine right of kings, because Jesus himself said paying taxes to Caesar was awesome. People have basically tried to say that Jesus is giving us a politics lesson here, but in the context, that's not what he's doing. He's giving halakha, and there's a lot of context we need to examine here. And I'm also not saying, by the way, that these things can't be applied to politics. Obviously, the Bible has things that we should use and rely on and take to heart as we make political decisions, because the Bible needs to influence our whole lives. But on the other hand, God is neither a Republican nor a Democrat. He does not have political parties, and he does not ordain earthly powers one more than the other. The left-handed kingdom is kind of uniform in God's eyes. So this is not supposed to be used as a guide or a how-to or even a justification of a particular regime. This is something that happens very specifically, and that Jesus is dealing with a very specific set of terms. He's dealing with the Pharisees, trying to trick him into hurting his own position, and he's not going to fall for it. So first off, let's look at a denarius. This is those things that are Caesar's. This is actually one of Tiberius's own denarii. He had 5 types of denarii. Only 3 of them really survived. This was his favorite one. They were produced at his mint, and they were specifically produced for paying soldiers and paying taxes. So we have a couple images. On the face, we have the image of Tiberius himself, and there's abbreviated there in Latin, reading beyond the abbreviations, Tiberius Kaiser, Divi Augusti, Filius Augustus, which is my attempt at non-church Latin. That translates to Caesar Augustus Tiberius, son of the god Augustus. Tiberius was Augustus's adopted son, the same way Augustus was Caesar's adopted son. They were related, but they were not true fathers and sons. On the rear, you see the Roman goddess Pax, and she is surrounded by the abbreviation Pontifex Maximus, or Pontiff Maxim, but it stands for Pontifex Maximus, meaning high priest. This is idolatry. This is pure, unadulterated, no pun intended, idolatry. You have to keep in mind, the Roman religion, even though it was very similar to the Greeks, it had its own unique flavor, and one of those was the degree of civic religion. You'd seen it previously with certain times in Athens' and Sparta's history, but to the Romans, statecraft was worship. They literally believed that Augustus and Julius Caesar were gods. They elevated dead emperors to the level of gods. They would even have their own temples and cults surrounded to them. So things like paying taxes were viewed as acts of worship. Secular callings were viewed as acts of worship. And this wasn't even quite in the same way we view vocation, right? Because Jesus has already said, do all things to God. Live righteously in your vocation. This wasn't that at all. They actually had religious significance, and that's why there is a graven image on this coin. So, first of all, what is this coin doing in the temple? This is where Jesus is having this debate. And that's why Jesus asked this question, whose image and inscription does it have? There are idolatrous claims on this coin and an idol itself, a graven image of the goddess Pax. Why is that here? Why do you have that? This is the same place where when Herod was going to put a Roman eagle here a few decades ago, he ended up not doing it because the threat of war was too great. And now you're carrying this idolatrous coin into temple grounds? How dare you? But he doesn't just go and say that. He asks a question. And again, these are Pharisees asking him this, and he responds in a Pharisaic way, following rabbinic precedent. There are 4 stages to this. We see this all the time in rabbinic literature. The outsider asks a hostile question to the rabbi, trying to trap him, which they have certainly done. The rabbi responds with a counter question. The outsider answers the counter question and thus exposes himself and becomes vulnerable to attack, and the rabbi then uses that answer to the counter question to refute the hostile question without compromising himself. So Jesus says, whose image is an inscription is that on the coin? Caesar's? Okay. Render to Caesar that which is Caesar's. Render to God's that which is God. And with this relatively simple counter question, he's calling a lot of things to mind, specifically in the Jewish numbering, the first 2 commandments. The first commandment being, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. So Tiberius is claiming to be a god on this coin. That's a problem. Second commandment, you shall not make unto you any graven images or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or the earth beneath, or that is under the waters under the earth, and you shall not bow down to them nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. I visit the iniquity of the fathers unto the children of the 3rd and 4th generation of them who hate me. But I show mercy unto thousands of them who love me and keep my commandments. So why do you have a graven image here? The inscription is blasphemous. The image is blasphemous. Everything about this is blasphemous. It also calls to mind, by the way, the Shema, the Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Part of daily prayer, said multiple times a day. And he's like, okay, I'm not falling for this. I'm gonna go to the spirit of this questions without ever answering your question about should we pay taxes. I'm going to get to the root problem that is set up here. It's also worth mentioning, by the way, that in Jewish thought, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, render to God's the things that are God's. Everything is God's. Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and all men who dwell in her lands. By the way, the refrain of Psalm 24 we sing every year on Palm Sunday. Lift up your heads, ye mighty gates, be opened up, ye ancient doors, so that the King of glory may come in. So Jesus is still referring back to the triumphal entry. So in Hebraic thought, everything is ultimately God's. In Roman state religion, Caesar makes the same claim. And the denarius is what stands for this claim. Tiberius is claiming to be a god, to be the son of a god, and be favored by the gods, and he is demanding worship via the state religion. So they've set up Jesus for failure. He has to make a bad decision, right? No, he doesn't, because he's refusing to answer the question posed to him, and instead answering the spirit in which the question was answered. He's not avoiding the issue. He's not evading it. He's instead challenging it. He answers it with a challenge to them to choose their loyalties. This is not Jesus talking about politics. He's really just rephrasing a choice he's posed before. God or the world. You can't serve 2 masters. And the Pharisees are impressed with this. They are amazed. The word in Greek is thaumasantes, awestruck, marveling. The suggestion of the word says that they actually may begin to speculate on the matter. If you feel this marvel and you feel this awestruck, you actually begin to think. So, what Jesus is basically saying here is like, how about you give these idolatrous coins back to Rome, who made them, and also give God his due. If Caesar wants to make that claim, that's fine. My kingdom is not of this world. I'm not interested in this, and I'm not about to play your game. And the Pharisees are impressed, and they actually begin to think. And this brings up the idea that Jesus is not and never has been seeker-sensitive, quote-unquote, but he does meet people where they're at very often. He doesn't fall for the Pharisees' trap, but he gives the sort of answer they might expect if he truly was a rabbi, which he is. He gives them the answer. He gives a halakhic saying to them. He exposits the law to them in their own way. And so they're impressed at his expertise, and they begin to think about what he said. This is really in contrast to the Sadducees, who are just getting angrier and angrier and more murderous. So now we see them try to have their own little turn with this, with verses 27 to 33 of Luke chapter 20. Then some of the Sadducees, who deny that there is a resurrection, came to him and asked him, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote to us that if a man's brother dies having a wife, and he dies without children, his brother should take his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers, and the first took a wife and died without children, and the second took her as wife, and he died childless. Then the third took her, and in like manner the 7 also, and they left no children and died. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife does she become? For all 7 had her as wife." This is again, the Sadducees are challenging Jesus' right to give halakha. They're trying to get him to give a statement on the law. It's worth noting, by the way, that again, the Sadducees rely almost exclusively on the Torah. They have been going with the Pharisees for a very long time, and we have records of these debates. And the Pharisees, when, for example, on the resurrection, the Pharisees will bring up the prophets, they'll bring up Ezekiel, they'll bring up Isaiah, and the Sadducees just go, no, that's just symbolic. If you can't prove this to us from the Torah, we aren't admitting you to the table. Unless you think this sort of argument has gone away, it absolutely has not. If you haven't met such a person, I'm relatively confident you will at some time in your life, or either in person or on social media, who loves to say things like, well, I don't really want to hear what Paul has to say. I want to hear what Jesus has to say. Or, don't quote the Old Testament to me. That's the Old Testament. I want to hear what Jesus has to say. The idea being, okay, if it's not in the Gospels, I can use whatever mental gymnastics I want to get out of my legal and religious obligation. So the Sadducees and the Pharisees have not exactly had productive debates, because the Pharisees keep going, no, it's in the prophets, you idiots. It's in the prophets. How can you not understand this? What is wrong with you? And Jesus is now being brought into the fray. Now, when Jesus has engaged with the Pharisees previously, he's often debated them on these fences around Torah, these things that are going to be codified in the Talmud. And the Sadducees are now taking it one step further, and they're saying, we want you to make a ruling on Torah itself. But again, they aren't doing this in any sort of genuine spirit of inquiry. They don't actually want to learn. They don't believe in the resurrection. They're just trying to beat Jesus at a halakhic discourse. They're trying to say, oh, well, let's give you the most absurd argument we possibly can, get a good dig in at the Pharisees, and prove how empty your ability to teach is. They're also potentially trying to trick Jesus to get him to somehow contradict Moses so they can dismiss him as a blasphemer. And they've had this long history with the Pharisees, who keep trying to bring up the prophets. And Jesus himself, when he's preached previously, he tends to bring up the prophets a lot. Even this last passage before this, he brought up the Psalms. So they're like, oh, he's going to bring up something that we can dismiss and say, no, we want to know from the Torah how you address this. And Jesus is going to do that. Jesus doesn't fall for traps. Now, with the Pharisees, he's answered them in their way. With the Sadducees, he's going to answer them in their own way. And he's going to, in both cases, he will do so with such a way as to demonstrate his authority as a rabbi and his right and ability to rule on halakha. So Luke chapter 20, verses 34 through 40. Jesus answered and said to them, "The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are counted worthy to attain that age, and the resurrection from the dead, neither marry, nor are given in marriage, nor can they die any more, for they are equal to the angels, and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But even Moses showed in the burning bush that the dead are raised, when he called the Lord of the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. For he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him." Then some of the scribes answered and said, "Teacher, you have spoken well." But after that, they dared not question him anymore. So Jesus has done three things here. He has just put the nail in the coffin. He first rebuked the Sadducees' basic doctrines. He's like, I know you don't believe in the resurrection, so let's, by the way, get that out there. The resurrection is going to happen. By the way, I'm going to prove it to you from the Torah. I don't need to go to the prophets. I'm not falling for that little trap. I don't need to go to the prophets to prove how wrong you are. He's also exposited more on what's going to happen in the resurrection, saying that there will be no marriage. And third, he's offered this new interpretation of the account of the burning bush, and he's spoken this with authority, giving this context as a matter of fact. He's just totally destroyed their arguments on every level, and all they're left to be able to say is, Rabbi, you have spoken well. He has utterly nullified their arguments, and they're lost, and they know it, so they've stopped talking to him. It's interesting that, the Pharisees are struck with amazement, and a word is used for this amazement that indicates they're going to start thinking about these things, whereas the Sadducees just don't want to talk to him anymore. Again, I'm not here to defend the Pharisees. The Pharisees are not the good guys to the Sadducees' bad guys. But it is showing how there are going to be different audiences to Jesus' message. This continues in the book of Acts even, and it thus is really no surprise that we see Pharisees come to Jesus and the Sadducees don't. By the way, just as a matter of interest, the Talmud contains discourses between the Sadducees and later Pharisees, something that take place after the destruction of the temple. And Gamaliel II, in the 80s and 90s, actually gives a similar answer to their denial of the resurrection of the dead as Jesus does. And many scholars think that this is evidence that the Pharisees kept on having discourse with the Christians. It doesn't mean they converted, but they kept having discourses with Jewish Christians, and that passages like this and arguments like this actually helped form the Pharisees' own arguments. So Jesus has destroyed the Sadducees, and the Pharisees come back to him. And we're going to switch really briefly to St. Matthew's Gospel here, because Matthew gives the same account, but he gives us slightly more context. And I think it's important to have that, because it's a nice bookend to this halakhic dispute. So we're switching to Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked, testing him, and saying, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like to it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So, really briefly, this testing is not really a bad thing. This is not again, remember, this is the word lawyer here means teacher of the law. This is not like our modern conception of lawyers. And it was a common practice, and indeed still is now, that you go and test rabbis from other schools, and you test new rabbis to see what they're going to say. And so that's what they're doing. They're like, okay, what are you going to rule on? What are you going to say is the greatest commandment? Because again, the rabbis had created different hierarchies of commandments and different rankings of them to say which was the greatest. And Jesus had already kind of engaged with this with the Sabbath, because some of them had said the Sabbath was the greatest commandment. And he's even said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So they're asking him this question again. And there's really no need to assume malice on the part of this lawyer, because we can really just assume that, or just as easily assume that the Pharisees, they were just beaten at their own game. And now the Sadducees have had a turn, and Jesus has just so resoundingly defeated them. They're like, okay, it seems like he might be one of us. Let's see what he actually says here. Now, note, Jesus had already had this discussion. He'd had it back in Luke 10. In Luke 10, it was asked in the context of inheriting eternal life. Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he gives the same answer. In this context, it's being asked as a matter of halakha. What way should we walk? What is the greatest commandment? There's a very interesting parallel here with the story of Hillel, again, who predates Jesus. Hillel once debated a Gentile who said he would convert if Hillel could explain the whole Torah to him while standing on one foot. He was being very flippant towards Hillel. And Hillel stands on one foot and says, What is hateful to you, do not to your fellow. This is the whole Torah, the rest but commentary. Go and learn. Jesus expands this, and he gives the Shema first. The Lord is our God, the Lord are alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. And then he goes further, love your neighbor as yourself, because these two are tied together, because you both share the image of God. So Jesus has now given one of the most fundamental halakhic declarations he could possibly give. But he's not done. He's about to address that very first question they brought up to him. because they've engaged with him, and he's about to give another answer to, where does my authority come from? Let me tell you. So keeping on with Matthew chapter 22, going to verses 41 through 45, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." He said to them, "How then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool'? If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him any more. So Jesus has brought the halakhic discourse around Passover to an end. And he's done it in a really interesting way. Remember that no verses exist in isolation. So he's quoting Psalm 110, verse 1, but let's read the rest of it. "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of your strength out of Zion. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people shall be volunteers in the day of your power. In the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning you have the dew of your youth. The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He shall execute kings in the days of his wrath. He shall judge among the nations. He shall fill the places with dead bodies. He shall execute the heads of many countries. He shall drink of the brook by the wayside. Therefore he shall lift up the head." So Jesus is basically answering their question. He's saying, okay, I'm the Messiah. And they're possibly willing to hear him out. I mean, after all, his lineage would have been known. And they focus very much on this idea of the son of David. The entirety of the triumphal entry and everything Jesus has done up to this point is kind of that, not necessarily totally conforming, but could be viewed as conforming to the expectations of the son of David. They're viewing the son of David as almost a second coming of David. Remember, David is the king who makes Jerusalem what it is. He's the one who lays the foundation for the building of the temple under Solomon. He is the man after God's own heart. So they're expecting this warrior king to come in. And Jesus is saying, okay, he's the son of David, but that's not all he is. How then does he answer that, or how then does David call this person his Lord? The answer is obvious, but they won't give it. They're too scared to give it. He's saying the Messiah is actually God, and the Messiah's reign will be tied to all the terror and majesty that it means to be the Son of God. And the language of Psalm 110 ties into that messianic imagery, tied to the Olam Haba, the world to come. And that's going to be scary. So he's refocusing this because everyone knows he's a descendant of David. It's been clear for a while that he's made messianic claims, and people at least are regarding him as the Messiah. And now they've asked him, well, what authority do you have? And he's talked to them. He's demonstrated his authority and that he can answer these questions well and skillfully, and they can't deal with that. They can't overcome him or debate him or beat him. So he's saying that, you know what authority I did all this by? God's authority. I am the Son of God. I, as the Messiah, in my work as the Messiah, go far beyond anything you've thought up to this point. So it's really no wonder they're all too scared to debate him anymore. And no wonder that amidst all this, we see people like Nicodemus and others come to Jesus to talk to him privately. Jesus has really established himself as a force to be reckoned with in Jerusalem, whereas before he's been wandering Israel and gathering in the lost sheep. He's taken it to the leaders of Israel in this passage. And it's no wonder that, some of them are getting angrier and angrier, and some of them are getting more and more excited because they perceive and yet do not perceive what is actually happening. They perceive correctly. The Messiah has come, and he's about to come into his kingdom. But they don't quite understand what shape it's going to take. We'll return next week to the Gospel of Luke to see the other teachings that Jesus gives in Jerusalem and begin the account of Passion Week. Until then, stay safe. I'll talk to you guys next week.